In this section, we get into river restoration techniques. There's some great questions asked as well, so stick around for those.
River restoration isn't something that's new. There's been a concerted effort for at least the last 40 years in Australia to restore some rivers or some functionality of rivers. Sydney Harbour was one of the first ones, the Parramatta River, where in the year 2000, for example, there was not one oyster in the Sydney Harbour catchment. And they did two things in the early 2000s, and actually a little bit before. One was banning TBT, tributyl tin, which was a boat anti-foul, which killed everything. And two, they fixed up the sewage leaks. And basically now there's the water quality has improved remarkably, and there's now oysters all the way to Parramatta, which is where the tidal limit is. And even though there's a lot of legacy pollutants in the river, so much ecological functionality has returned to the Parramatta River. There's also been concerted efforts along some of the Murray-Darling Basin rivers, the Shoalhaven River, the Hawkesbury-Nepean, Clarence, the Richmond. There's been significant programs to improve and restore rivers. Now, one thing that all these have in common is they've pretty much all failed. There's been lots of local successes and regional failures is the way I'd put it, because the scale of funding and resourcing going into restoration, plus also the length of time, the duration of the impetus to restore rivers, and work going in through Landcare, through catchment management committees, then authorities, and even local land services in some areas, different government agencies, councils. We're still on a backward trajectory. And so the idea now, which I encourage, and I think is being encouraged more, is trying to look at a catchment scale, looking at the science more to see what works and what doesn't work, and having more realistic goals. So the old goals of we're going to restore the river is probably not possible in a lot of cases in the short term, but slowing the damage, getting on the right trajectory is possible. And so at a local scale, there's very different decision making to a catchment scale. Ideally, all rivers would take a catchment view because you are impacted by everything you're doing, everything that happens upstream. You are suffering inefficiencies because of those upstream impacts. So, 30 or 40% of your work might just be overcoming that extra damage that's been happening because of the nutrients and flows and everything that's coming from upstream. So one thing I'd suggest is to any group working on rivers is that it's both a blessing and a failing of Landcare. And I put it this way quite often, that Landcarers have an obsession at their site. They have a fascination with the area. They have an interest in the region, and they might occasionally give a passing glance at the landscape. So your fascination obviously is at where you can have the major impact, where you have the most influence, where you have the most control. But I would argue that, especially for riverine projects, you've also got to have an interest at the catchment level. And this, I'm not saying driving the car for 3 hours and go up to the Upper Hunter and plant trees with Landcarers up there. But what I'm saying is that getting involved in processes, getting involved in consultations, talking to the local land service, being an exemplar for other groups upstream, talking to your neighbours upstream in the immediate level. Think about the catchment. Think about the people up the hill. Try to influence beyond your patch is going to be critical for actually making your job in your patch easier. And the opportunities to engage in those broader processes, whether it be government or non-government, are probably less than they were 20 years ago. Around the turn of the century, there were catchment committees and catchment authorities. There were community consultative committees for things, native vegetation and waterways. Those sort of things have disappeared, but it doesn't mean you don't have a voice. And so, when you do get grants from local land service, you should also be talking to them, asking what they're doing at a catchment level. Even something like a concerted effort off the side to start at the top of the catchment and clear out castor oil plant or Arundo Donax or privet, or doing weeding programs, or getting large woody debris in stream, or doing upper catchment revegetation, which drops flood levels here. Those sort of strategic initiatives help you, even though they might not be spending money on this patch. It means that everything you do is much more efficient and effective. And also, most critically, in terms of group morale, if you're not having half your work destroyed or set back, you're going to maintain much more enthusiasm as a group to go forward. So, it's a plea, it's an encouragement to actually do get involved with broader catchment and landscape processes. You have a voice. The government says that Landcare is a partner. Insist on that partnership. So the key principles for river restoration, I'm going to talk here in two levels. One is river restoration, one is riparian restoration. So for river restoration, it's really the wet bit and things you can do to improve the wet bit. Riparian is the banks. So one of the ideal things, best things at a catchment level to restore the river is to restore the flow regimes to what it was pre all this damage. Now, at a whole catchment level, that is what I said before. You need to get up and plant out as much of the upper catchment as possible, restore wetlands in the upper catchment so they hold the rainwater rather than it running into the river straight away. That is for you to advocate as opposed to you to do. But even on your local sites, you do have opportunities to slow water in the landscape. Farm dams are one way. I mean, farm dams have the negative sides, but also in normal rainfall events, they do hold the water back in the landscape rather than letting it flow into the river straight away. But also finding places where there's problems from water flowing from the landscape into the rivers. So we have behind us an erosion gully where the water's obviously flowing through and cutting out. Those sort of micro projects are still good for, in aggregation. If there was a couple of hundred of those in an area, that would actually stop a significant amount of water hitting the river fast. So look at your opportunities in your landscape to keep water up further in the landscape. Tree belts, there's some evidence that keyline farming and ripping can actually hold water in the landscape. Utilising farm dams to slow water flowing through the landscape. These are sort of the general good farm planning you could do, which can actually improve the water in the river. At landscape scale, restoring the riparian zones will have significant impact on improving the river itself and the river ecology. So there's been a number of cases from river restoration projects where doing large-scale bank restoration can result in cleaner water, water that's shadier, so it's cooler, more food falling into the water for fish, more woody debris falling into the river, so improving fish habitat. So, while it's the bread and butter of Landcare is planting trees, it can actually have really good benefits for the aquatic vegetation, even though in most cases that's probably not front of mind for most Landcare groups that are doing river work. They're usually doing it for erosion and riparian zones. Selecting the right species and getting the right sort of scale of revegetation can do significant things for improving the river. And even though you do need massive scale to have full restoration, even having sections of good habitat is actually necessary in the long term, because it's those areas where you might actually have good riparian vegetation and shaded cool water which are the Refugia. That's where your native fish and your frogs are going to live. And so every time someone upstream or downstream does a bit more revegetation, they can colonise out. So we need to maintain some areas that are good habitat along the entire length of the river while we join the dots. For river health overall, managing sedimentation is critical. We can see in the river here, we've got the sandy banks forming in the middle of the river. That's not ideal. You've got the river's more turbid, so there's more finer sediments in the river. The finer sediments do a number of things. They block light reaching the bed of the river, so any plants that grow on the bed of the river find it harder to grow because they're not getting the light. A lot of organisms that rely on algae, such as mussels, the freshwater mussels that live in the Hunter River. If you have the water that's too turbid, you don't get the right algae growing usually, so they can't filter feed. And when they are filter feeding, they're spending a lot of their energy sucking in dirt and spitting it out again. So managing sedimentation, it's everyone's responsibility. Will doing a couple of kilometres of riparian revegetation help the river measurably? Probably not. But everyone does have to do it eventually to actually get to that level of improvement. So good land management in the catchment, fixing gullies, stopping overland flow, trying to get levees and wetlands reinstated will all improve the water quality in the long term. I'd say it is possible, and I say this with a massive maybe, it's pretty much possible to restore any ecological and geomorphological process with enough time, resources, money. So you could actually, if we had unlimited money, we could put this back 250 years. But is it realistic? No. There is never enough money or time or effort available to really restore any ecosystem at scale. We need to do whatever we can, but we're never going to have enough to really restore everything quickly. And that's why I think it's important to set things on trajectories, that within the resources that you have, the time that you have out of your busy lives to spend on the Landcare works, the time that the money that you are putting in, the grants that you get, if you can actually set things on the right trajectory, and so things aren't degrading anymore, but they're on a positive spin, it means that you could probably maximize your impact over time. There's also a risk in over-investing. So again, this idea of, yes, you could come in here with machines, smooth all this out, densely plant trees, the next flood could take it all away. So you could invest a lot and lose it, while if you took the line of, okay, putting the fence back, planting your trees and your native grasses, it might cost 5% of the resources, which means that other 95%, you could do another kilometre of riverbank on the right trajectory. So you don't need to gold plate everything straight away, is what I'm getting at with riparian and river restoration. We need a whole lot of action over the long term to set us back on the right trajectories. For whole of catchment management of improving rivers, ideally you start at the top of the catchment and work down. Now, that is probably the strategy that agencies should take, but it also but that ignores the fact that there are people all the way down rivers that want to do things. And so while here in the lower catchment, I mean, you're not quite estuary, but you're in the lower third of the river, it's not the most ideal place to invest government money to do things. It is actually critical to maintain the enthusiasm of people. If you only start at the top of the catchment and it's told you, people here, we'll get you in 30 years' time, no one's going to be interested in Landcare in 30 years. So governments need to invest in areas that might not be optimal for whole of catchment restoration, but it's critical to maintain enthusiasm, educate people. You can't restore the rivers without restoring catchments, is my statement there. That, and we've covered this before, that so much that happens up in the hills impacts the water. So you can't look at the rivers in isolation. And so having good agricultural practices, maintaining your soil, maintaining nutrients on site, restoring wetlands up in the catchment is also critical for overall river health, for all the reasons I talked about before. So for those of you in Luscantire who don't face onto the river, your planting of rainforest groves up in the hills, or your building of corridors, or your ensuring that your erosion's fixed up is actually a river project. One thing to consider with restoring the rivers is there's a lot more externalities. So things that you're going to be impacted by a lot more things outside your control. If you're doing a Landcare project up in the hills, or away from a major river, you can have a fairly good level of control over what happens, whether you're undertaking natural regeneration, bush regeneration, or planting trees, fencing, keeping pest species managed. It's a lot easier up there than it is down here, because there is so much more impact. Things happen faster. There's more energy in the system, so things like erosion can happen more, floods happen more. So you've got to, when you're restoring rivers and riparian areas, you've got to be much more prepared for the, 2 steps forward, 1 step back approach, rather than if you're doing similar sorts of works, planting or regeneration away from rivers. We were asked about the engineering, whether it would be better to engineer a bank like this. And the answer is, as I said before, you can. It still has risk of failure, and it is very expensive. And it might not give you the outcome you want, or if it does, it might mean you can't do other things. So there are times in my professional life that I have used machinery, especially where there was catastrophic failures that might continue on. And there was one case where there was a 180-year-old house right behind a slope like this, and in those cases we couldn't do anything but engineer. You couldn't rely on the natural processes. So the only thing I'd suggest with engineering is you need to get professionals in. There's been so much damage done to rivers by people with machinery coming in and thinking that's the right thing to do, and it's not. And even things like we see here, the previous owners had dumped a whole lot of concrete in the base. Things like that can result in more turbulence and more erosion rather than less erosion. So getting geomorphologists or geotechnical people in to give advice, I think, is critical if you're thinking about doing any earthworks on riverbanks. There has been some really successful river projects. I mentioned that I worked on the Hawkesbury Nepean for years, and we got about 60% of the landholders on the river the 100-kilometre stretch we were working on, working together. And we actually saw great improvement, especially in those areas where we had entire reaches of river being worked on at once. So basically every landholder in a stretch of river was doing their thing. And what we found was that by getting your neighbours involved, the weed burden reduced, because you weren't getting weeds moving in from next door. And there was always that encouragement for the person who was at the edge to get the next person upstream or downstream to get involved as well. The riverbanks, we had slumps filling in through time. We had amazing recovery of fish species in those sections there where whole sections of landholders got involved. And bird life. One of the main reasons a lot of people got involved with the Hawkesbury project was they love birds, and just getting the riparian zones in and planted had amazing response with bird life, even after a few years. There was some of those sites were joining up patches of bushland, and so it allowed movement of a whole lot of bird species that had been stuck in their patches for a long time, and they're able to move and colonize new areas. Also, another project that was a real successful one in terms of river process was the McDonald River. Have any of you been to St Albans? Yeah, Beautiful little town, great pub. They do really good schnitzels. Yeah, it's my barometer how good a country town is can they do good schnitzels. But the town of St Albans used to be a port. The river trading boats used to come from the Hawkesbury all the way up to St Albans for agricultural produce and take the groceries up. And what happened in the late 1800s, early 1900s was the river filled in, and basically the river was flowing underground. You could walk across the river, and it would only flow during a flood. And what happened was two things. There were a number of catastrophic fires in the upper catchment in quick succession. So when the area was first being opened up, people were lighting fires and they were getting away from them. And also they cleared the riverbanks. And the McDonald was a beautiful example of a river that had levee banks and backwaters, swamps. And what happened as soon as they cleared the riverbanks and allowed cattle down to the river, those levee banks collapsed and fell into the river. So instead of having a river with water in it, it filled up and you basically had a shallow sandy bed with water sort of trickling over the top, mostly flowing under the ground. And had been like that for 100 years. And so the riverbank program got landowners involved to just plant the trees where the levee banks would have been. And so they, from the banks back about 25, 30 metres in that river, because it's not as big as this, they planted a whole range of species. In some areas there was some plants left, so they also allowed for natural regeneration. But what happened was you got kilometres and kilometres of contiguous vegetation, and it happened for a few years. So the trees were getting up to 5, 8, 10 metres tall, and a flood came down. And as I said before, floods, when a flood comes down, the water flows faster down the centre of the river and slower at the edges, so sediments get moved uphill. That revegetation got buried. So you actually had trees sticking out from the top of the sediment. Like you mentioned here, that you had all the sand laid down in the flood. But that vegetation then held that sediment in place. So instead of it flowing back into the river, it stayed there. So for the first time within human memory, you had not only levee banks, so that the floodwaters started getting held back in the floodplain, but you actually had a river with water in it for the first time. And so that was as simple as planting trees, reignited, kick-started geomorphological processes. And as far as I know, last time I spoke to the person that took over that program, who took over the program after me, people are still doing that planting on the levee banks, and they're fencing off the river from cattle. There's been a big program to put in off-river stock watering points, so little solar pumps and troughs. And those riverbanks are restoring, the levee banks are restored, you've got wetlands forming again, and you've actually got a river. And so, 30 years ago, they probably would have thought, or 40 years ago, they probably would have thought to get it back, you would have had to do significant investment with lots of machines. But now, planting a few trees and bang, you've got things kick-started. And so at a catchment level, doing that renaturalisation, doing Landcare can actually have significant impacts. So not only at your local scale, you can reach your local aims, but as you affect the Landcare cancer and get the people upstream and downstream, and this mob of 5 or 6-fingered people across the river there to do Landcare as well, you can actually kickstart processes that will really improve river health quite quickly sometimes. There's also, there was a great success doing one thing, a range of things down in the Snowy River. You might remember around 15 years ago now, there was an agreement to start putting water back down, environmental flows back down the Snowy. A couple of interesting things there was the scientists came out and said, and I can't remember the exact figures, but the scientists basically said, you need to release flows that will be like 25% of the original flows to kickstart any environmental processes. And the government went, okay, well, you got 10% now, you say 25%, we'll give you 18%, that's a compromise. So it obviously showed the government didn't understand the idea of thresholds. You need that or more to actually have benefit. But anyway, they got the 18%, but they're able, the Southern Rivers Catchment Management Authority did some amazing things in the catchment. They cleared the willows from hundreds of kilometres all the way down to the Victorian border. They restored levee banks and wetlands. They planted riparian zones. They bred up and reintroduced fish that had gone extinct in the river. And with the flows that were coming out, and they have increased over time, the river is now kick-started, both geomorphological, so the river's meandering and having the right sort of earth processes, as well as the ecological processes are on these amazing trajectories for recovery. So it can be done. There's also a group called the Australian Rivers Restoration Network, I think, or it might be association, and they run out of Canberra, but they've done some projects in New South Wales where they have a threshold for getting involved, and they tend to do subcatchments, not big rivers like this, but they might pick a subcatchment, and they will only get involved if they get every single landowner involved in it, and they will do everything. So basically, they'll remove every single woody weed, they'll revegetate every single bank, they'll fence off all the rivers to the appropriate distance, and put in off-water stock watering points. And so that subcatchment, they can tick it and it's done. And so both the ecology and the geomorphology in those subcatchments is on this beautiful trajectory for recovery. And what that does in a river system, it creates what are called refugia. So basically, you might have some functionality in a river here. You might have some of the native fish still surviving. You might have, with small populations, you might have some mussels and you've got some wading birds still using it, and some functionality. But a flood comes through and they might get wiped out. They've got to recolonise from somewhere. So this Australian Rivers Restoration Network idea is, if you have these subcatchments along the river which are in really good condition, every time there's a damaging event in the mainstream, those things can actually move back down into the main river. And so as through time, the main river can be worked as a catchment level, it's got the species being maintained in the environment so that it can renaturalize over the long term. And so I suppose the summing all that up is that while river restoration, not the riparian, but river restoration has to be done ultimately at catchment scale, it is still local scale works are critical for that long-term restoration of a river. Repeating the question was, can I touch on willows a bit? Because some people still want to plant willows. Poor misguided souls. Willows, there was a truism that willows were really good for rivers because you could get a willow wand, stick it in the mud and it will grow. And it's true, they did stop especially toe erosion, but the impact of willows is significant. The negative impacts are significant. So willows can make rivers shallower because the roots actually collect sediment, so they can exacerbate flooding by raising the bed too much. Also, what happens is they drop all their leaves at one time. And so at a landscape scale, if you've got hundreds of thousands of willows along a river, all dropping their leaves, as they rot, they pull all the oxygen out of the water. And there's been a lot of black water events, so basically fish kills, caused by willow leaves. And so deciduous trees are not good to have along any Australian river. We don't have many deciduous trees in Australia. The leaves that fall from trees tend to be quite hard and they don't rot quickly. And so we don't have that sudden demand of oxygen from the rotting of them. Functionality-wise, what you can do with the willow, you can also do with longstem planting. So have you all heard about longstem planting? No. There was a guy, and I can't remember his name. Okay. Fantastic bloke. I don't know whether he's still alive. Down on the Central Coast, developed this system where instead of planting tube stock with a root ball about yay deep and planting the plants yay deep, he grew his plants still in the normal forestry tubes, but grew them about a metre high, 1.5 metres high, by force fertilising and force watering them and making them compete for light. So what you end up with is a root ball about that big, and a stem up to 2 meters tall. And he went into riverbanks with a water jet, a pump and a water jet, and jetted deep holes into the ground, dumped these plants in so that the root ball was right down low, and you suddenly had that much sticking above the surface of the ground, and then backfilled it. And so the trunks of the native plants would put out roots. So what it was doing was establishing deep-rooted plants really quickly, the same as willows. It overturned the truism that, how I think some of you might have heard back in the day, when you're planting a native plant, you've got to make sure that the soil is exactly level with the pot, because if you have any soil built up around, it's going to kill it. He put that to rest. And it also, this methodology for riverbanks worked a treat, because I was going to get into it later, but I'll cover it now. A lot of riverbanks are actually quite dry. They're both too wet and too dry. They're too dry in that riverbank soils are often hydrophobic. So, I'm sure you've all seen pouring water on sand, it sort of puddles. Some soils repel water, and a lot of riverbank soils do that. And so a lot of trees, even with fairly good rain, will dry out on riverbanks and die. So you'd need to get them well established by hand watering often. So by getting the roots down deep, it was down close to the water table where the ground was moister, so the plants had more chance of survival. And also, because they put out those lateral roots from the stems, they're able to hold soil together fairly quickly. Longstem planting, even in areas where you can still access and maintain, it's still a fairly quick way to get plants established on riverbanks, and it reduces the risk of plants being washed away in floods, because if you plant normal tube stock, they're probably vulnerable for a couple of years before their root stock is big enough to stop the flows pulling them out. So the deep stem plant, the long stem plantings were really good for reducing the risk of flood damage. We also tried it as a off the side story up in the Capity Valley, which is the upper reaches of the Colo River, west of Sydney, up near, go to Lithgow, turn right, near Ralston. Huge problems with salinity. There were hillsides that in the sunset would glisten with salt. And the Landcare group, Capity Valley Landcare, had huge trouble in some places establishing plants because the soil was so salty. Because there's salt in all soil, and what was happening when it rains, the salt would dissolve and evaporation would bring it up to the surface like a wick, and it would just form on the surface. And that happens lots of places around the state. So we tried the long stem planting, and we got the root ball below where the salt was. And so those plants were able to establish, and once the plants got their roots established, it sucked down the water table. So the salt, next time it rained, the salt got pushed down further into the ground, and salinity disappeared in those patches. So there's some really clever ways of overcoming barriers. So yes, long stem planting is better than willows.